Gunfire cracked through the warehouse, sharp and hungry. Detective Harold Lawson, 57, moved low and fast behind a stack of cold blue drums. Mary Collins, 52, hugged a sealed envelope against her chest, the plastic slick with sweat. The envelope held a stained ledger and a small drive that could torch a career and clean out a precinct. The stakes were simple and brutal. If they lost the evidence, a network of corrupt cops and criminals would stay hidden. If they lost each other, no one would live to testify. Ray Wallace, 60, called out from a rusted catwalk. Ray Wallace said, "Hand me the package, Lawson, and maybe I let you walk." Lawson kept his eyes moving. Lawson said, "You never had a generous streak, Ray." A bullet hissed past Mary and tore a cone of dust out of the concrete. Lawson's hand came up to wave her into a shadowed alcove, and the fluorescent spill from a dying fixture lit the jagged scar that cut across his knuckles and tracked down his wrist. It was a pale, puckered brand, the kind of mark that looked like a memory that never slept. Mary felt the same cold stop inside her chest that had seized her weeks earlier when she first saw it in a sterile room with a humming recorder and the smell of old paper. In the warehouse, the scar was a flag. In the precinct, it had been a message. Mary pressed her back to the wall and tried to breathe. Mary said, "They will not let us out of here." Lawson risked a glance around the barrel. Lawson said, "They will, if we give them something else to chase." He shrugged off his jacket and tossed it over a bleeding, wide-eyed security guard who had crawled into their shadow with a hand clamped to his ribs. Lawson said, "Stay with me, kid. You get a name, you say, Sergeant Mason. You say it loud." The guard nodded, trembling. A memory hit Mary like a flash grenade. She had sat at a metal table under punishing fluorescent light while the hum of the vending machine filled the silences. She had been giving her statement to the kind detective, and his voice had been low and careful. Then he reached for the recorder and the cuff of his shirt pulled back. She saw the scar, and everything inside her froze. She heard her own voice in the memory as if it were someone else. Mary said, "That mark tells more than words ever could." Lawson had met her eyes and did not pull his hand away. Lawson replied, "Some pasts refuse to fade, even in the light of day." Back in the warehouse, the catwalk rattled as Ray shifted his weight. Ray Wallace said, "You still carrying that guilt on your skin, Harold?" Cute. The man loves his souvenirs. Lawson ignored the bait. Lawson said, "Focus on the math, Ray. There are more of us than you see." Footsteps drummed toward the far door. A figure darted across the open floor, a shooter with a shaved head and a bright track jacket. Lawson stepped out and fired twice, clean and tight. The shooter spun down. Mary swallowed hard and held the envelope higher under her chin to keep it dry. Mary said, "We cannot let this vanish again." Lawson kept moving her with small gestures, his touch light, his breath steady. Another memory pushed through as if it were part of the smoke. The note on the desk that day had not belonged where it sat. It was tucked under her file, on a cluttered station desk that smelled like coffee rings and old toner. It was a single line in block letters that did not shake. Ask about Hawthorne lockers. Ask about Hale. Mary had looked up at Lawson, and he had already seen it. A burst of automatic fire shredded a pallet to their left. Lawson yanked Mary down and slid beside her, concrete dust in his teeth. Lawson said, "Do you trust Sergeant Mason?" Mary kept her eyes on the open aisle. Mary said, "I do not know who I trust. I know I trust what I can hold." She tapped the envelope with the back of her hand. Above them, Ray laughed, a sound like a steel door rolling shut. Ray Wallace said, "Mason is in over her head. You are both already ghosts." A small radio clipped to Lawson's belt crackled with a sound like wind across wire. A voice bled through with a flat affect and a strange cadence, as if reading from a code book while underwater. Unknown voice said, "Cradle's overturned. Bluebird is inside the nest. You have a traitor in your house. Repeat, you have a traitor in your house." Lawson put his back to the wall and listened to the dead space after the transmission. He looked at Mary. Lawson said, "That is an internal channel." Mary felt her throat close. Mary said, "Then it is our house they mean." The lights flickered and hummed, and somewhere metal clanged like a bell. The word traitor hung in the stale air like a scent that would not lift. The radio spat one last fragment, a whisper bent by static. Unknown voice said, "Cat in the cradle, check the first day, check the scar." The channel went dead. Mary stared at Lawson's hand. She remembered the first day clearly now. She remembered the chill, the smell of paper, the mark that had stopped her voice mid-sentence. The gunfire faded to a nervous silence, and the memory pulled them back through time to the room under the lights where nothing was supposed to happen except the truth. The precinct at midday felt like a refrigerator running on fumes. Fluorescent strips buzzed. The walls were painted the kind of beige that ate conversation. A copy machine clicked like a metronome, steady and indifferent. Mary sat clear-eyed at a metal table with a recorder between them, its red dot an unblinking pupil. She had come to give a statement about a robbery she had witnessed outside a grocery store on Figueroa. She had also come with a question that had been aging for decades. Lawson slid a legal pad toward her with the same careful hands he used on breakable things. He had the bulk of a man who could move a door with a shoulder, and the voice of someone who had learned to sit and listen. Lawson said, "Start with the part you are comfortable saying out loud." Mary opened her mouth and talked about headlights and a mask and a voice, like gravel. She did not tell him about the nights she still woke up, tasting smoke and hearing a phone ring that never gave her what she needed. He reached to adjust the recorder. The cuff edged back. The scar caught the light and drew a pale line across years that pretended to be separate. Mary blinked, and time narrowed to a point. Mary said, "That mark tells more than words ever could." Lawson left his hand where it was and held her eyes. Lawson replied, "Some pasts refuse to fade, even in the light of day." The hum of the building pressed into the room. Down the hall, someone laughed at the wrong time. Mary breathed through the pause. Mary said, "My brother's file was mishandled. I know it. Evan Collins disappeared in '97. The last place anyone saw him was near a storage complex by the Hawthorne tracks. He was scared. He made one call before he went under. He said he heard cops. He said he saw a scar." The words landed like weight. Lawson did not flinch. He looked older by a year in a single second. Lawson said, "The storage complex was dirty business for a long time. People lost their way there." Mary slid the grocery robbery aside with a movement of her hand that felt like clearing a chessboard. Mary said, "I want to reopen it." Lawson took it and wrote the name on his pad in a neat hand that respected the dead. Lawson said, "Then we will start at the beginning." He clicked off the recorder and set it aside. On the desk behind him, in the chaos of files and half-emptied coffee cups, lay a folded note that did not belong to any case. Mary did not know it was for her until Lawson saw her glance and slid it across with 2 fingers. The paper held a single sentence. "Ask about Hawthorne lockers. Ask about Hale." A name followed in a cramped script, Wallace. Mary traced the letters with her eyes, not touching them. Mary said, "Who wrote this?" Lawson kept his voice neutral. Lawson said, "Someone who wants this to come out without screaming it in daylight." He turned his palm upward, the scar a pale crescent. Lawson said, "You are not alone in this." Sergeant Linda Mason, 45, leaned into the doorway like a caution sign. She had a steady posture and a face that had learned to hide how much it cared. Mason said, "Collins, right? I pulled the box from archives. It is thin." Mary looked at the worn cardboard Mason carried like an injured thing. Mary said, "That box is not thin. That box is stripped." Mason's eyes flicked to Lawson's hand, then back to Mary. Mason said, "If you reopen, you will need to move quiet. We have holes that were not there last year." Lawson nodded once. Lawson said, "Then we move quiet." A phone on the wall rang with the harshness of an alarm. Mason reached for it, but Mary was already moving. She lifted the receiver and heard breathless static and a voice disguised by a hand over a mouthpiece. Unknown caller said, "You are walking on a grave, Mary." She gripped the phone and forced her voice still. Mary said, "Who is this?" The voice pushed through, soft and close. Unknown caller said, "Hawthorne was the second stop. He never made it to the river. Ask for locker 30. Ask for the ledger. Do not trust the chain." The line clicked dead. The room felt smaller by a foot on every side. Mason stood very still, her hands empty. Lawson wrote the words without looking up. The fluorescent light hummed, and the smell of coffee and paper pressed in. The past had been waiting in that room like a patient shadow. Mary looked at Lawson's scar and felt the old grief move like a storm cloud taking shape. Somewhere in the building, a copier started again, marking time, as if the world would not stop even if the dead finally spoke. They began with dust. The archive swallowed them in windowless quiet, rows of boxes that whispered with the weight of what people forgot or pretended to forget. Mary moved with purpose. Lawson moved with a map in his head that still knew where ghosts lived. Sergeant Mason came down twice to check their progress and to warn them about whispers drifting through the bullpen. Mason said, "Watch your chain of custody. Watch your login trails. Someone is reading your moves." Lawson nodded and kept turning pages. Lawson said, "Then we give them just enough to choke on." Locker 30 at Hawthorne was a rust-pitted unit with a cheap brass lock that had been replaced so many times the hinge looked chewed. The bolt cutters felt wrong in Lawson's hands, but he used them anyway, and the lock dropped like a tooth. Inside, a plastic tote held ledgers in a bookkeeper's hand, neat as a confession. Names floated up like oil. Transactions lined up like tracks. Ray Wallace's name threaded through the pages like a cable. A second name tightened everything. Vernon Hale, deputy chief, decorated, untouchable. Mary stared at the ledger until the columns blurred. Mary said, "This is how they kept score." Lawson took a photo of every page with slow precision. Lawson said, "Ledgers make enemies. Enemies make mistakes." He secured the book in an evidence sleeve and gave it to Mary because he trusted her grip more than he trusted any locker in the building. The more they pulled, the more the trap revealed itself. An alert pinged on Lawson's phone, locking him out of certain case files. A corridor camera positioned toward records caught a man walking by twice in 10 minutes without a file in his hand. The man did not look up. In a spare room, they set up a folding table and triaged what they had. Mason stood with them and did not touch the ledger. Mason said, "Hale is protected by 10 layers of goodwill. You go at him, you better be surgical." Mary glanced at Lawson, then back at Mason. Mary said, "I am not afraid of stitches." Mason's mouth moved in something almost like a smile that did not reach her eyes. Late, when the building had thinned out, Mary cracked a file whose tab had been relabeled twice. The paper inside felt older than the box. A memo stapled to a report laid it open. The words punched through her like a dropped bar. It was an internal note from 1997, signed by Lawson's old lieutenant. It documented a directive for officers to stand down on Hawthorne surveillance during a sensitive operation. The note listed a meeting between Ray Wallace and then Lieutenant Lawson as a point of contact. It included a line about an informant gone dark and a recommendation to classify the disappearance as voluntary pending further action. Mary set the pages down with the care she might use for a fragile photograph. Mary said, "This says you met with Ray the night Evan disappeared." Lawson took the paper and read it twice. He did not defend himself right away. Lawson said, "I was a different man. I believed I was doing the least harm I could find. That does not change what happened." Mary's throat tightened. Mary said, "Your signature is right there. Your silence took his breath." Lawson closed his eyes for a second that stretched. Lawson said, "I cannot give you an easy answer to that line." Mason shifted, restless energy under a tight surface. Mason said, "You both need to know this will shake the tree in ways we cannot control." The room felt like a drum. The words sat between them like a loaded magazine. Mary wanted to shout. She did not. She packed the ledger deeper into her bag and looked at the man whose scar had brought her here. She heard her own voice and made it steady. Mary said, "We keep going. We do not blink." On the way to the parking lot, the cool night air hit them like a rinse. Lawson's car door handle had a folded card tucked under it. Mary saw it and pulled it free. In block letters, with careful spacing, was another message. Stop reading. The scar is a lie. Next time, it is your neck. Lawson took the card and turned it over. No fingerprint powder, no waiting. He slid it into a different envelope and held it like a thing that could burn. The overhead light hummed. Somewhere a bus sighed. The city kept its secrets, but the edges were starting to fray. They moved through the next day like it was balanced on a glass edge. Inside the precinct, eyes did not meet theirs. Conversations broke off when they walked in. Files they needed were out on another desk. Key cards did not work on the first try. It was 100 small turns of a wrench tightening the same bolt. Mary asked Lawson to sit in an interview room. She put the confidential memo on the table between them and did not soften her voice. Mary said, "Your silence doomed him." Lawson did not look away. Lawson replied, "I thought I was protecting us all, but now I see I was burying the truth." The air in the room closed like a fist. Mary stood and turned her back to him to keep herself from breaking. She pressed her palms against the cool metal of the door and let a breath out slow. When she faced him again, some of the heat had organized itself into a purpose. Mary said, "If you want redemption, it starts with telling me everything." Lawson told her things he had not said out loud. He told her about the night he met Ray in a parking lot behind a shuttered diner. He told her about a man from the command staff who used his reputation like a shield and his silence like a weapon. He told her that the Hawthorne operation had been sold as a necessary compromise, a way to shut down a violent ring without tearing down their own house. He told her that he went along because he thought he could steer it. He told her he was wrong. Sergeant Mason came in with a stack of reports and a face set to calm. Mason said, "I talked to someone in internal. These waters are moving. A high-ranking officer is watching what you are doing and not in a friendly way." Mary looked at the door behind Mason as if expecting it to move. Mary said, "Hail." Mason did not confirm. Mason said, "Names will fall on their own. Stay smart." Ray Wallace surfaced like a tide stain at the edge of everything. Surveillance photos put him near Hawthorne twice in the last week. A traffic camera caught his truck outside a strip of shuttered businesses that hid more than they sold. Lawson recognized the route and marked it with a red pen. Lawson said, "He's not the boss. He's the tool someone uses when they do not want to leave fingerprints." Mary nodded, the ledger heavy in her bag. Mary said, "Then we do not chase the tool. We set the trap for the hand." They tried to quietly loop in a colleague, Detective Jamie Torres, 34, who had a clean pair of eyes and a brain that could do math under fire. Torres took the ledger and ran quick entries against city contracts and forfeiture records. He called them that evening, his voice tight with something like fear. Torres said, "You are right about Hawthorne. It runs straight up and it runs wide. If you are going to move, move fast." The line fuzzed. A horn blared through the phone. Torres said, "Meet me at the warehouse on River Street. I will bring copies. Keep your heads down." They never got to the meeting. When Lawson turned onto Torres's street, red and blue lights pulsed against a row of stucco houses. A small crowd watched from their porches. Torres lay on his back in the driveway, that same clean face already dimming. An officer knelt with two hands locked over the center of his chest, while another counted off compressions. A neighbor said she heard a shout and then a crack like a board snapping. A wallet lay open near the curb. The scene wore the costume of a mugging, but the timing was a message. Mary stood on the sidewalk with her hands in fists, and the night felt like a trap that had sprung shut. Mary said, "He called us 10 minutes ago." Lawson scanned the faces and the shadows and the alleys. Lawson said, "They are cleaning the edges." He turned to Mason, who had driven in silent behind them, and now stood with her jaw tight enough to ache. Lawson said, "We are running out of places to stand." Mason looked at the house, at the body, at the neighbors fighting tears. Mason said, "Then we stand where they cannot spin the angle. We stop this at the source." A wind came up, dry and hot. The city pushed on. The three of them stood in the wash of cruisers and ambulance lights and felt the line between right and wrong pitch like a boat. Somewhere, a radio crackled with an encrypted tone that Mary recognized from that warehouse. The same flattened voice cut through in a snatch of code. Unknown voice said, "Cradle's moving, cat in the window, warehouse on river, bring the scar." Lawson met Mary's eyes. The trap was set. They were about to walk into it or spring it. There was not much difference. They went in low and fast under the dying lights and the smell of oil and dust. The warehouse on River Street had been waiting for them since the first time they heard the code. Ray Wallace's men were posted like bad habits, hiding behind crates and ancient machinery that never ran anymore. Lawson counted them without moving his lips. Mary held the envelope with Torres's copies tucked inside now, a weight that made her posture straight. A voice rolled off the far mezzanine, smooth and confident, the kind of voice that filled a room without shouting. Vernon Hale stepped out with a shine on his shoes that did not belong in that place, and a sidearm held with casual practice. He looked like the department's yearly banquet had been shipped into a warehouse by mistake. Hale said, "Harold, I thought you would be smarter than this. You bring a civilian to a fuse box." Lawson kept his own voice quiet. Lawson said, "You killed Torres." Hale did not blink. Hale said, "Torres failed to understand chain of command. These things happen when the weather is bad." Ray Wallace swung down from a ladder like a man coming down to greet an old friend. Ray Wallace said, "You know what I miss, Harold? When you knew which way the wind blew." Lawson watched Ray's hands. He saw the tremor in the right one, a thread of shake from an old injury that made Ray prefer to shoot with the left when he had to be perfect. Lawson said, "You never had the wind. You only had someone else's fan." Mary stepped to her mark. She lifted her phone and hit record. Mary said, "Deputy Chief Vernon Hale, do you deny that you met Ray Wallace at the Hawthorne Storage Complex on the night Evan Collins disappeared?" Hale smiled like a man indulging a child. Hale said, "Miss Collins, you do not know what you are asking." Mary held his gaze. Mary said, "I know exactly what I am asking." The ledger sat visible in her bag, a bright lure. Ray's eyes flicked to it and back. Hale lifted his chin and made a small motion with 2 fingers. Men moved. Lawson raised his hands, empty of a weapon, and talked. Lawson said, "Ray, you lived your life doing other men's dirty work. You have one chance to do something that belongs to you. Look at him. He will leave you on the floor and make a toast at your funeral." Ray's jaw flexed. Ray Wallace said, "Save the sermon." Lawson took one small step to the right and put a high steel pillar between them. Lawson said, "You are shaking. You think she does not see it. You think Hale does not write about it in the margins." Hale's mouth flattened. Hale said, "Take him." The shots started. Metal rang. Sparks jumped from a cable that should have been retired last century. Lawson moved on instinct, drawing his sidearm from the small of his back, a place no one had checked because they assumed the old man had finally softened. He was dry and fast. He put one round into the ground in front of a runner and used the panic to close the distance to Ray. He grabbed the winch chain and dropped a load of warehouse steel between them and Hale's angle. The chain screamed. The pile hit like a small car. Mary slid along a crate and reached a metal desk bolted to the floor. She popped the middle drawer and found an old reel recorder jammed in sideways under a cloth. It was dusty, but the power light winked when she thumbed the switch. Mary said, "They recorded themselves." Lawson did not look. Lawson said, "Get it. Get all of it." She fed the reel and pressed play, and a voice from 1997 filled the space like a ghost stepping into daylight. Vernon Hale spoke from another year, younger and colder, ordering the stand-down at Hawthorne, instructing his men to make the informant a problem that solved itself. On the reel, Ray Wallace said, too loud and proud, that the kid would not talk again. Hale's voice came back with a clipped "thank you" and a time. Hale saw the tape and overplayed his hand. He stepped out into the open and fired, 3 quick pops, fast and low. A bullet smashed the old recorder, but not before Mary had already held her phone in front of the tiny speaker for 20 seconds of confession. She looked up and locked eyes with him. Mary said, "Your guilt has haunted us both for too long." Hale shook his head like a teacher disappointed in a student. Hale said, "Guilt is for people who do not lead." Lawson took his shot. He did not aim for the kill. He took Hale in the shoulder and spun him. He moved in and put a knee into Ray's wrist and kicked Ray's gun under a forklift. He kept his own weapon trained and made his voice carry without shouting. Lawson said, "Hands where I can see them. Ray, if you reach, I break that wrist for good." Ray bared his teeth and showed his palms. Hale tried to straighten and froze when Mary pointed her phone like a badge. She had never felt stronger. She had never felt more tired. In the sharp quiet after the echo died, Lawson looked at his hand. The scar sat there, ugly and honest. Hale laughed from the floor through clenched teeth. Hale said, "Tell her what that brand means, Harold. Tell her you got it for fighting me like a hero." Lawson shook his head slowly. He looked at Mary and finally opened the last door. Lawson said, "They say I earned it in a fight. That is the lie that went around. The truth is uglier. The night I stood down at Hawthorne, I walked into my kitchen and put my hand on a live radiator until I could not feel anything else. I thought if I marked myself, I would never forget what I did. I thought it would make me better. It did not. It only made me remember. Every scar is a reminder that I failed to protect what mattered most." Mary heard the air leave her lungs and come back in as something new. There were tears, but they did not blur her sight. She stepped closer to him, not to comfort, but to bear witness. Mary said, "Then help fix it." Lawson nodded once, a vow without flourishes. He holstered his weapon and radioed. Lawson said, "Sergeant Mason, we have Hale, we have Wallace. We have recorded confession. Bring cuffs and a clean team. Use names we have not used yet." Mason came in 5 minutes later with 3 uniforms she trusted and an expression like a storm held on a leash. Mason said, "Keep your hands where they belong, gentlemen." She cuffed Hale herself. She read Ray his rights with a voice that made no promises. She took the ledger from Mary with care and signed for it like it was a newborn entering the world. Mary stood there and let the moment stamp itself on her bones. Outside, the night breathed easier. Inside, crime scene tape fluttered in the draft from a broken window. Lawson sat on a crate while the medics dressed a slice on his forearm he had not noticed. He looked at Mary. Lawson said, "It will not bring him back." Mary nodded. Mary said, "It brings the truth. That is the beginning." Mason stood nearby and made calls that would tear open corners of the department that had not seen light in years. Later, in a quiet hallway with the old hum of fluorescent lights and the safer smell of fresh coffee, Mary filed a formal statement that folded the ledger, the tape, and the names into a chain of custody that would hold. She signed her name in a hand that did not shake. Lawson watched from the doorway. Mary turned to him and nodded once. Mary said, "We keep going." Lawson said, "We keep going." The arrests shook the building. Vernon Hale was charged with conspiracy, obstruction, and the kind of crimes that stain a badge for a generation. Ray Wallace faced the book. An internal audit rolled through the precinct like a fire line. Reforms followed, slow and imperfect, but real. Sergeant Mason took a post with internal, a job no one envies that she was born to do. The anonymous voice from the radio turned out to be a communications tech who had risked everything to cut through the jam. He went on record. He got threats. He kept walking. Mary went to the river and watched the water move. She did not say goodbye to Evan because he had never been where she could reach him. She said hello to the part of herself that had been waiting. She went home and slept like the house knew it was safe. Lawson drove the long way along streets he knew by muscle memory and listened to a city that sounded different when you let it. He did not hide his hand. He did not hide from it. He showed up to work the next morning with paperwork heavier than a gun, and the sense that maybe redemption was not a finish line, but a direction. Sometimes the deepest secrets hid in the scars that time refused to erase. In a cold room under bad lights, that truth had stopped a voice. In a warehouse full of echoes, it had finally spoken. And in the quiet afterward, justice did not roar. It took a breath and settled in, ready to hold the line.